Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a series of interviews with some extraordinarily interesting people that we've been hosting over the last couple of weeks in the run-up to the conference, Coronavirus and International Affairs, that we will be holding online on the 17th of April. Don't forget, registration is required but free, so please feel free to sign up. And please take advantage of the other interviews. We will now have a grand total of 10. Feel free to peruse them. They're all up on the Coalition for Peace and Ethics YouTube channel and available for you to watch. It is my great pleasure today to introduce yet another really interesting speaker with a very interesting perspective. Is Bethany Salgado. She is currently working in demand planning and customer logistics within the consumer products industry while she's completing her master's in international affairs, for which I'm very grateful. She has been gracious enough to serve as my TA and RA, and I will be really sad when I have to lose her. During her graduate program, Bethany has focused on corporate governance and responsible business conduct, in addition to attaining a certificate in supply chain management. Prior to starting her graduate studies, Bethany worked at the State Department, where she helped U.S. companies implement best practices for social and environmental responsibility across global supply chains. She also has experience with a variety of think tanks, nonprofits, in state and federal government. And for me, this is very exciting because we have talked about coronavirus and its effects in the international arena from virtually every aspect, in the public law arena, in the societal arena, and the like. But where we've really never concentrated very much is in the context of business and private enterprise. And so I'm actually delighted to have you here to speak about this. And so I want to dig right in. And I was going to ask you, so what's it like working in the consumer products industry right now?
So I think initially what most people would expect is that right now it's just a very busy time for people in the consumer products industry. You know, we're having to stretch a lot of our resources and our staffing in order to meet a really big increase in demand. And it's definitely challenging companies in a unique way to respond to a global crisis. One of the things that I think has really stood out in terms of demand planning in this time is that because we're dealing with a crisis that's been unexpected, and we're having to all as a society learn how we need to react, how we can prepare ourselves. In the consumer products industry, we've seen this unique rise in what we call panic demand. So regularly, we would have kind of a systematic demand that we can track and predict over year. But now, because this pandemic came up unexpectedly and people are reacting by sometimes even hoarding different supplies, we're having to deal with a really unexpected and hard to track demand pattern. And so that unexpected demand is forcing us to deal with what's known as the bullwhip effect in supply chain management. And essentially that means that the less certain we are at a consumer level about how demand is going to impact our supply chains, the wider breadth we have to plan for, the higher up a supply chain you go. So effectively, that means that we're dealing with a great amount of uncertainty in terms of demand planning, production planning, and it makes it a bit of a struggle to ensure that we are allocating our resources in the right places and in order to meet the right customers so that we ultimately get product where it needs to go. But
well, I'm sorry, but that's really interesting. So you've been mentioning supply chains. And of course, when you deal with supply chains, certainly over the last 20 or 30 years, it's almost code for dealing with cross-border transactions and cross-border economic fractionalization of your process. So I'm assuming that in your business that you're dealing with the same kind of thing, even if we're talking about napkins and toilet paper. And so I was wondering how, in fact, you're dealing with that transnational aspect of the challenges that you have, that you've been describing in the context of your supply chain and pandemic.
So it absolutely is a global problem. When it comes to a global pandemic, you have to have some kind of global response. And so in a consumer product supply chain that spans a globe, even within a single company, you may have suppliers from all over the world. And that's one of the things that makes this both good in terms of having global resources to be able to fulfill customer need, but it is sometimes also a challenge because take, for example, the early days of the pandemic when we first saw it coming out of China. There was a lot of factory shutdowns, a lot of people forced to stay home, and they weren't able to work and be able to produce some of those goods that we rely on, particularly here in the US. We import so many products from China. And so to have those factories shut down and to have an extreme shift in where we're able to actually source our products has certainly become a big challenge for supply chains. And so the great thing about having a global network of suppliers and factories and different pieces of the supply chain is that you're able to kind of minimize the risk in any one location. And so when a pandemic hits and you have one country shutting down their borders and forcing people to stay home from work, you can rely on other areas of your supply chain around the world to try and fill those gaps. But it certainly also causes challenges and in a unique, I guess, shifting of operational status for people because even within the consumer supply chain, it's consumer goods supply chain, you're seeing a lot of people who work traditional desk jobs starting to work from home. And so I, for one, have been working remotely for a month now, and it's been a really unique experience to see how we're continuing to work with our global partners to ensure that we meet as much of the populace's demand as humanly possible, but from a different perspective. And so, you know, that flexibility to be able to work remotely, but also that dependability that we have on the global resources of our companies is really what's able to keep us going in this time of uncertainty.
Right. You've raised an interesting point. You, in a sense, if I heard you right, what you're talking about, the way that this sector of economic activity protects itself is by hedging its supply chain. So you aren't completely dependent on one area or one country, but that you have multiple areas where so you don't have a supply chain. What you have are multiple supply chains all feeding in like spokes feeding into the central hub here in the US. And that was very interesting. A lot of companies, it's not clear, are following the same model as in your industrial segment. And so here's my question. It's in two parts. One, do you think that the pandemic will make it more likely that other industrial sectors, to the extent that they have not adopted this multi-spoke hub supply chain system, now begin to diversify where their supply chains are oriented so that they're not relying on one place? But at its limit, and we've heard the politics of this certainly in the United States over the course of the last several weeks, is this creating incentives for industries, not just in your sectors, but to the extent, you know, generally in American industry, is this creating incentives to rethink the idea of bringing your supply chains home, that is bringing them back into the US or into NAFTA or into somewhere close?
I think it's certainly posed a lot of interesting discussions. But what I'll say is that the idea of a globalized supply chain is to be able to spread out that risk of having things like natural disasters or pandemics actually influence your supply chain. The more globalized your supply chain is, the better able you are to address issues that arise in one location by spreading your operations around the world. So I think, to answer your question in two parts, first, I think that people are starting to understand that a global supply chain is really a resource to global companies and companies that provide key services right now. But as much as you may see borders closing and a lot of travel restrictions, perhaps even barriers to import or export, as you may have seen in news reports, there's a lot of companies that are struggling to be able to get their products out to other countries, because if they're being produced within a certain country, perhaps that national regulation and legislation is trying to keep hold of what little supplies there are in the world right now. And so I think on a federal level in many states, it's been definitely difficult to deal with this idea of a global supply chain being able to spread supplies where they need to go. And so it's a consideration to face is, what can you have a global supply chain that helps to support people around the world in a time like this? Or is it easier to bring it home and really just stick to your home market? But ultimately, I think that the better answer to that question is that a global supply chain gives you the flexibility to deal with those types of risks of unexpected demand and global issues that you can't predict and you can't really plan for. And it also allows you to respond better when those things do happen. So your response capacity ultimately is far better off when you have resources that are spread out and able to step in when some areas of the world are struggling. And on top of that, the idea of bringing a global supply chain back to a home market in this day and age is really not that feasible. The idea of trying to bring in all these outsourced functions of organizations and relocate them to wherever their home company or their parent company is located, it would take years to be able to make it actually happen. So at least in the short term, I don't think the answer is to bring all of those functions of a supply chain back home. And really, like I said, globalization can be an aid right now to these supply chains that are desperately trying to fill the need for things like personal protective equipment or even food.
Okay, and I imagine that that may be as true whether we are talking about the model of globalization before 2016 or even the America First model.
Absolutely. I think, regardless of what an individual country's perspective is on the idea of protectionism versus globalization, the idea of having a supply chain that is able to minimize risk to its operation capacity and that is able to address widespread needs in a time of crisis like this, I think outweighs the idea of protectionism.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. If I can, I'd like to shift our conversation a little bit to human rights and human rights in supply chain. And I want to do it in two contexts. One context, so I'll lay this out and then you can work through it. In one context, there has been a tremendous amount of discussion, certainly among civil society all over the world, in the nature of the responsibility of businesses when there are shocks to a supply chain, the responsibility of the apex company to protect the integrity of the supply chain against those shocks by doing a variety of things, ensuring that workers downstream are adequately taken care of, ensuring that downstream suppliers or entities are not made fragile, ensuring those kinds of things, right? At the same time, right, so that there's one, it's the responsibility, a human rights responsibility attached to the protection of the supply chain. You made it, now you're responsible for keeping it. And the language is usually the language of human rights. You're dealing with the individuals, but also with respect to the earnings potentials of countries who are downstream. That's the first kind of bucket of human rights related concerns with respect to supply chains. The second is more internal, assuming in fact that we're not worrying about supply chains, we're worrying about your operations at the individual worker level. The question during the pandemic itself is not necessarily, the human rights question about the pandemic itself is not necessarily about supply chain, but is about anything as mundane, although as critically important as the ability of the company to supply appropriate PPE at work sites, or to ensure a program of cleaning and then to assume the responsibility, that is the risk, for failures to provide proper PPE or the failures to provide the proper cleaning, right? And so those two things, the business community has tended to frame this in a business sort of language, but the human rights community and the and civil society has tended to frame these in human rights terms, and yet they remain significantly important economic factors for companies as well. So I was wondering if you can talk about both aspects of this from a human rights or economic or other perspective.
Sure. So I think the first thing that I'd like to say is that companies can't ignore their social responsibility. Right now, public health is of the utmost importance, both to the communities that businesses serve, as well as to the employees that make that happen. And so that has to be at the forefront of any decisions that companies are making right now regarding how they're maintaining their operations in a time of a crisis, as well as how they're able to meet the needs of their consumers while being respectful and reasonable with what they're asking of their employees. So in terms of the services that companies such as those within the consumer products industry are dealing with, is that we're providing services for basic household essentials, for food items, things that are really necessary for people to be able to maintain their day-to-day lives. And so there is a need for these supply chains to keep running. And while not everything can go to an online format, you know, we still have warehouses and different distribution centers that have to remain open to be able to physically ship different products out to the stores and to the consumers where they need them. But there's ways that companies can take protections both for the safety of their consumers and for the safety of their employees. Now, you see a lot of companies, and I'll name one just because it's been in the news a lot lately. Amazon has been under a lot of fire because of the way that they're handling their employee relations in this time where they're desperately trying to keep their warehouses staffed, but people are scared to come to work because maybe there's a lack of personal protective equipment, or maybe they don't want to work the mandated overtime that their supply chains are forcing on them because there's just a dire need for bodies to be in these facilities to be able to get the product out to consumers. So there's very valid concerns from the employees about being able to protect themselves if they're in a position where they have to go into a work site. Now, I completely agree with every company that has been able to implement as many remote working options for their employees as we've been able to use thanks to technology nowadays. But there's also, again, that concern about having personal protective equipment for those people who don't have the luxury of being able to work from home. And so being as flexible as you can about how you treat your employees and how you manage their schedules to ensure that proper social distancing guidelines can be followed throughout your facilities, and to ensure that they have appropriate personal protective gear. It's a struggle, but it's something that businesses have to be wary of, because from a human rights perspective, why should someone have to come into a facility to, put their health at risk for the sake of someone else's when they don't have the proper gear to protect them? And there's brave people out there who are doing this on a daily basis and making makeshift protective gear to ensure that they're staying as safe as possible. But I think companies need to keep in mind that there's going to be delays in supply chains. There's going to be different barriers and operational slowdowns that make it hard to keep operations going at a normal pace, particularly when companies are eager to get food and paper products and those types of things out to consumers because they really need them right now. But companies also have a responsibility to their internal employees just as much as they do to giving those goods to the end customer. And so being able to increase PPE and sanitation throughout their facilities is really going to be the best way to do that, along with making sure that they are flexible in understanding with employee concerns and giving them a forum where they can talk through those concerns and try and come up with some creative solutions about how to meet those and address those issues where they come up in their operations.
All right, thank you. We are getting close to the end of our time, and I was wondering if I could throw a curveball at you to end our discussions and see where we lead off. And then, of course, we'll all be participating in the conference, and hopefully we can deal with some of these issues at greater length over the course of the event on the 17th. So here's my question. We've talked human rights to some extent. We've talked politics. We've talked supply chain. We've talked the social embeddedness of businesses. But I want to talk sustainability as we end off. And in particular, not just environmental sustainability, but sustainability in terms of biodiversity, in terms of the connectedness between renewableness, for example, as well as environmental climate change and the like, and the work that that industrial sectors, including yours, do. So I was wondering, as we end this discussion, to what extent do you see a connection between what the COVID-19 pandemic has done and its exposure of issues dealing with sustainability that companies, irrespective of what governments do, that companies really have to begin to recognize and to meet the challenge of over the short or medium term?
I think that's definitely an interesting question, and I think there's a lot left to be seen on that front. But one of the things that strikes me about supply chains right now that are really trying to ramp up their production and their sending of products out to stores and to consumers is that you're seeing a huge rise in the number of transportation teams and companies around the world that are increasing the number of truckloads that they send out of products. And one of the key areas of climate change and environmental issues that companies try to address through their supply chains is things like greenhouse gases and being able to reduce the carbon footprint of their operations. And as you're seeing these supply chains ramp up to capacities they've never had to do before, I think there's a challenge to trying to keep that environmental mindset and the idea of protecting those key resources in our environment and trying to be responsible within our environment and sustainable. I think that those are issues that companies need to continue to keep within their the front of their minds as they are dealing with COVID. And it may be a challenge. It may be hard to have that at the front of your mind as you're sending out thousands more truckloads than you may normally do on a day of business. But I think there's going to be a lot of civil society that comes out and speaks to the issue of environmental considerations, even as you're trying to meet these demands. But on top of that, you're seeing things, I don't know if you've seen on the internet, but there's a lot of different things like pollution has been going down significantly in some of those major areas, and people are taking notice. And those sustainability issues of seeing wildlife return to areas that they haven't been in so long because of human activity in the area, or seeing pollution start to drop in major cities, I think people are paying attention to it, and they appreciate that those areas of, environmental responsibility are finally starting to see some relief as people are out of their day-to-day activities. And so I think it's bringing light to some issues that people perhaps didn't really pay attention to before. And while it's difficult in this time for businesses in particular to keep in mind the responsibility that they have, both in human rights terms, but as well as sustainability terms, it's hard, but it's very necessary. And I think it's going to become part of a longer discussion that evolves as we start to come out of this pandemic and learn from how this process went and learn how to be better prepared in the future.
All right. Well, that is wonderful. On that note, I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time to allow me to drag you over such a broad range of issues. And I know that we will continue the conversation in the conference. Thank you again for taking the time to chat with us. And for our viewers, we hope to see you at the conference. And of course, if you've got questions or inputs, please feel free to submit them to us at the conference and the conference website. We will put them up. And thank you very much.